a Venn diagram going of indigenous traditions versus Western traditions, right? So we're going to paint with some pretty broad strokes here, kind of start in this big high level, and then we'll narrow it down as we go on throughout this module. But the indigenous traditions are basically, these are peoples who do not adopt the Western tradition of the world and live in pretty traditional societies. And they're usually found in places like Africa, North America, South America, and Australia, and parts of Asia. We call them the indigenous because these are the first peoples to live in those lands. And if they maintain a tradition, we believe that they've maintained a lifestyle that may span for thousands of years, which largely remains kind of consistent with little changes involved in it, right? So typically, and this isn't true for all indigenous groups, but typically indigenous groups follow certain kinds of patterns. So a lot of them will have animistic belief systems. Animism is a form of belief that says that all things in the natural world have kind of a spirit or a life force behind it. And so that would include things like living things like animals and plants, but also things like rocks and mountains and natural forces, the elements, things like winds, storms, fire, volcanoes, those kinds of things. There's obviously a lot of nature tied into animism, and so indigenous peoples tend to have a lot of natural focuses on their lifestyles. They're traditionalists, which means that they live kind of a steady lifestyle. It's a very stable lifestyle. It goes from generation to generation, and it maintains kind of the same patterns and the same outlooks. There's a huge focus on collective and family. We've got kinship groups become very, very important for indigenous folks. Material belongings are usually passed down through kinships. Leadership is passed on through kinship. And so there's a collective kind of focus as opposed to the individual focus that you find in Western traditions. Ethnobiology, ethnomathematics, and ethnophysics. These are ways of understanding the world and the universe around people, but through kind of a traditional and generational knowledge, a knowledge that's passed on from the elders to the next group of people. And there is a deep and rooted biology, mathematics, and physics in a lot of these cultures, right? So you go to places like the Iroquois or the Yoruba or groups out of Australia, there are deep ethnobiological and mathematical and physical ideas, right? So for instance, things like the Bezier curve or the Bezier curve or fractals had been discovered thousands of years ago by groups like out of the Native American tribes as well as out of the Yoruba. Okay. Cyclical time, we'll spend some more time about this next week, but cyclical time is this idea that time is not from past, present to future, but time is repetitive and it goes through a cyclical process, and that there really is no difference between any of those three, past, present, or future, but that there is a blend of just existence that happens in a very cyclical way, or sometimes known as the wheel of time. Like I said before, there's a lot of stability and harmony here, and it's because of elders being the core crux of the knowledge base. A lot of these groups don't write, they're illiterate groups, so what their culture is embedded in the elders' knowledge. So that's very different from the Western traditions, right? So Western traditions are rooted in the Greco-Roman philosophy, history, and politics, right? So things like Plato and Aristotle, but also things that happen in like politically, so like the idea of a republic and a democracy. These are Greco-Roman. The Enlightenment period has a huge influence over Western traditions, right? So even like the formation of our country, the idea of property rights, the idea of, what is ontology, what's epistemology, so what do we know and how do we know it? These are all typically rooted in the Enlightenment, and you can actually carry that into the Renaissance as well. So right, those two time periods are very influential on how Western traditions have developed over time. Judeo-Christian traditions play a big role in the West. We talked a little about that in the last module. I would also throw in Islam, right? So Judeo-Christian Islam, because those three overlap so much. But we definitely have a Judeo-Christian kind of influence over a lot of our belief systems and our philosophies and the way our cultures are organized. Even the idea of like a patriarchy, for instance, can find its roots in Judeo-Christianity. There's a high emphasis on individualism in the West, right? So individual merits, self-reliance, self-responsibility. There's a bigger push on that in the West than say like collectivism, which we see in things like the indigenous groups, but also in Eastern traditions, which we talked about in the last module. Scientific reasoning forms the core of a lot of what we believe and how we know the world. If we didn't have science, we wouldn't have our technology, we wouldn't have our medical information, we wouldn't have computers. Like, this is all rooted in the scientific methodology and the scientific experiments, right? We tend to believe in linear time, so past, present, and future. This is linked to our science and our reasoning of cause and effect. This is linked to our experience of history. So we tend to look at things in a very kind of strategic way, or a way that is mapped out from past through present through future. We're progressive in that we tend to think of things as moving forward. There is a price to progress. There is a price of being traditional, right? So the price of traditionalism is that you tend to not develop things like science and medicine in the same way that we would in the West. But the cost of progressivism is that, you know, there's an environmental cost, there's a social and emotional cost, right? There's a price to being progressive. And then obviously we have a huge emphasis on technology. In fact, Westerners tend to divide their world and their history in a technological way, right? Starting back from like the Stone Age, going through the Iron Age and Bronze Ages, right? And then all the way up through the era of technology today, right? So like our conceptual age, or our space age, or our computer age, right? These ages are all based on our technology. We tend to map things in that way, okay? The overlap is that both groups have an ontology, right? Now, the indigenous peoples might not call it that, but what is ontology? It's what we know about the universe, or what is reality, those kinds of things, right? They both have an epistemology, a way of knowing the world, right? So in the West, we tend to look at things like scientific reasoning as a way, or the experience of things, so experiential, also empiricism, so like trying to, and logic. These are the ways that we tend to see the world. In the indigenous cultures, it's usually framed through nature, through traditions, through rituals, and through like the collective. Both groups are trying to answer essential questions. So like, why are we here? Is there a God? If there is a God, what's that God's purpose? What's that God like? What happens after we die? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of humans, right? So they both are addressing those essential questions. They both have a constructed reality, right? So the West constructs a reality based on how we know things. The indigenous groups construct a reality based on their world around them. And lastly, both groups are expressive. Their forms of expression help typify their culture, right? So the styles, the media, the type of arts that cultures engage in, these help define their culture themselves, right? So their forms of expression have some overlap sometimes, or can be very different stylistically, right? So these are the major kind of broad strokes that separate indigenous groups from Western groups. Now, like I said, there was a price. There's a price to having these groups and these groups meet. If you think back to our first module, we talked about how different tribes collide, and different tribes have to either assimilate or reject one another. These two groups tend to meet in certain ways throughout our history, especially if you look at modern history, stemming back to like, say, like the age of discovery or the age of sail, right? The Westerners tend to be the conquerors of these people. And again, going back to module 1, if you think about Jared Diamond's theories about geographic luck, he explains that as this group being able to conquer this group largely because of things like germs, and then later guns and steel. I want to discuss with you the differences between time's arrow and time's wheel. These are worldviews that help explain cosmology and history. Time's arrow tends to think of time moving in a forward direction. Time's wheel is about repetition and patterns. In the West, we typically rely on time's arrow to describe events and our understanding of the universe. Many indigenous groups around the world use time's wheel. Time's wheel has been employed by groups like the Maya, the Aztecs, the Blackfoot, the Sioux, and the Yoruba. So we can see groups from all over the world, Africa, North America, South America, have used a repetition or cyclical way of looking at time. Where in the West, we tend to look at things in terms of cause and effect or past, present, and future. So the large difference here between the two not only informs the way someone sees the world, but understands their place in the world. A lot of my research comes directly from F. David Pete. So Pete was a holistic physicist, and he was an author trying to popularize physical ideas. He carried a lot of his research in solid state physics, and also was a member or a founder of the quantum theory. Okay, so one of the things that Pete struggled with, and is still an issue for modern science today, was unifying the theories of quantum and gravity. Or, in other words, as Einstein had said it, the very, very big, massive macro forces that work on galaxies and the universe, and the very, very infinitesimal, the tiny subatomic worlds. The problem is these two worlds tend not to work very well. One of the largest things that Pete argues is there's two reasons for this. One is we have yet to find a particle that carries the power of gravity. We have particles that understand things like the forces of electromagnetism, the strong and weak forces, but we don't have one for gravity. There are some theorized ones, but we have not discovered them yet. Another thing that Pete had argued was it's the way we think. Although science is an incredible model and has allowed us to understand the universe in really robust ways, it's limited. The questions we create in science are limited by the model of science. And so what Pete decided to do was to try to break that model and look for outside influences. And so one of the groups he spent a lot of time with were the Blackfoot. The Blackfoot have a model of physics which rivals Western ideas. And that model of physics comes largely from a times wheel model. All right, so based on Pete's work and based on my understandings of some of these cultures that work on times wheel, I want to describe for you some of the differences here. My hope is also to dispel the noble savage and the savage myth. A lot of times in the West, when we look at indigenous groups of the world, we do one of two things. We either think of them as savages because they don't live and think and act in the same way that Westerners do. That's been the historical way of describing people's indigenous cultures. Or we call them noble savages. We put them on this pedestal and believe that they can do no wrong, right? So the classic example of this is looking at a Native American person and thinking that they're perfect because they're a Native American, right? They're in harmony with nature, they're in tune with the natural world, they're morally superior, they're better because they are who they are. When in reality, neither the savage nor the noble savage are correct models. The savage obviously paints a pejorative picture of the person and makes them seem less than human and dehumanizes them. The noble savage glorifies them to the point where they're not human again, right? They now are a model or a representation that is beyond human and is ideal. Neither are true. Indigenous peoples are peoples, just like everybody else. And to portray them otherwise is racist and pejorative. So what we're trying to do here is to show that it's not that people who lived in this worldview are lesser or better than people in this worldview. It's to say that they're just different and that there's overlap between them. Okay, I'm going to start with times arrow because that's probably the most familiar with most people. It's what Westerners typically think the world works. We look at things like models of time, history, cosmology, congruence and harmony, and how the world works from a macro and a micro standpoint. We tend to think there's a past, which leads to a present, which is moving towards a future. This is known as time's arrow because it is moving in one direction, just as an arrow does. An arrow is fired from the past and moves towards a future location. In the West, we tend to think this is how the universe works. There's the Big Bang explodes, creates all of the elements and molecules that we have in the universe today. We've got galaxies and superclusters and stars and solar systems and planets. And on those planets, we have actions like geothermal actions and geological actions, which then lead to biological actions, which lead to life, right? We've got this nice, neat picture of past through future. Okay, that leads to the idea that there's progress, and that leads to the idea of causality being cause and effect. One of the problems Pete had run into, and many quantum physicists had run into, is that cause and effect is a bias by the observer. We tend to think that's the case, but that doesn't necessarily mean it is true. That just happens to be the way that we live. And it's just as plausible that the reverse could be true, that effects could precede causes, or that future does not have to come or after the past. Basically, what Pete was trying to understand was, what other ways could we see things? Does it have to move in this times arrows way? Well, it turns out there are a handful of other models, and they largely base things in tradition, repetition and pattern, cycles like seasons or life cycles, meaning that there really isn't a clear distinction between past and future, but because things repeat over and over and over again, future leads back into the past, and there's an endless cycle of the repetition, right? This is sometimes represented by this kind of diagram, a 4-part diagram, which represents things like the seasons or the transitions between states. It's sometimes known as a medicine wheel. We have large versions of this, which are made out of massive stone structures. We have tiny versions of this, which are painted or crafted. And basically the idea behind it is that there really is no starting point or ending point. There just is. This is, by the way, not only unique to indigenous groups. There are many Eastern philosophies and Western philosophies that came to this conclusion as well, that time is cyclical. Okay. What's interesting about this for me is that because of time is cyclical, many of the groups that live in these kinds of worldviews believe that the purpose of life isn't necessarily progress or moving forward, but is to maintain a steady state. This is where that myth of Native American groups or indigenous groups are in harmony with nature. It's not necessarily that there's some kind of like spiritual, metaphysical connection there, although some groups do profess that. But in other words, it might just be the simple fact that maintaining tradition and maintaining lifestyles that are consistent leads to this kind of balance. There's a price to progress, just as there is a price to tradition. The price of progress is that as we continue to move forward as a society, we tend to use up our resources and have to physically move. We have to move from place to place to gather more resources. And as we grow more people and maximize our population, we end up having to move and take on more resources. That's the price of progress. The benefit of progress, though, is things like technology, things like medical science, the ability to prolong life, the ability to minimize tragedy during things like childbirth or sickness, right? Those are the benefits of progress. The benefits of tradition is that if you maintain a steady state in your society, then you no longer have the issues of overconsumption or issues of overuse of resources. And instead, you have a balance that's maintained. The price, of course, though, is that things like death are now quite inevitable and often have to be grappled with in a very real way, in a much more common way. One argument has been made that the real reason we have progress is that we're trying to cheat death as long as we can. Where here, a lot of groups just accept death as a part of the natural cycle. I'm speaking in broad strokes here, of course, but the idea behind it is that you maintain. If that's your worldview, and you believe that the whole purpose is to maintain tradition and maintain a steady state, when these two cultures collide, it's no wonder there were some issues. So, for instance, groups on the West, when they arrived in groups in the indigenous populations of the world, they often looked at these groups as being primitive or savage because they did not believe in progress. But the error of that thinking is that progress was the right way to go. Progress has benefits, but it also has costs. Tradition has benefits and also has costs. It's not that one is better than the other, they're just different ways of looking at the world. Interesting enough, also, you can arrive at similar conclusions from both worldviews. So, for instance, I have two images up here which are linked to mathematics and geometry as well as science. That's the image of fractals and the images of a Bezier or a Bezier curve. Both of these have been derived from mathematics, but it turns out indigenous folks have also discovered these things. So, for instance, fractals are repeating images of the repeating shape, just changed in scale or size. So, for instance, here I've got a Sierpinski's triangle, which is made up of tiny little triangles, all repeating over and over and over again. So I can continue to divide the triangle over and over and get the exact same shape. This shows up in nature all over the place, right? There are plants, shells from mollusks and other kinds of animals, trees, clouds. These things tend to fractal, right? Meaning that it's the same shape that just repeats over and over and over again. For instance, if you look at a tree, its branching pattern is the same shape repeated at different sizes and different intervals. And actually, it's a mirror image, right? So a tree's top and its roots are a mirror of one another. Fractals are apparent all throughout the universe. In science, when they discovered fractals, fractals were used to describe a lot of phenomena that we see around the world. But science wasn't the first or only place that we saw fractals emerge. In fact, Yoruba peoples have been using fractals for generations. If you were to take a helicopter and fly over a lot of different Yoruba villages, you'll find that the village is actually set up in a fractalized pattern. A lot of the homes are circular, and those circular homes are then arranged in circles. And then those circles of communities are arranged in circles. And the repeating pattern of over and over and over again maximizes efficiency and also has an aesthetic quality that people tend to like. Fractals mirror nature. So the Yoruba had discovered this generations before we had the word fractal and used in geometry or mathematics. Today, fractals show up in really cool kinds of patterns. We use it in computer technology and CGI graphics. One way to use fractals is to create mountains or landscapes in computer games or computer-based imagery used in films. So fractals have this really cool aesthetic possibility to them. If you'd like to learn more about fractals, I will link a video in there showing a handful of different fractals that are pretty common. The Mandelbrot set and Sierpinski's triangle are two of the most famous. So I'll link those in the YouTube clip. Another example comes out of the Bezier curve or the Bezier curve. So the Bezier curve was actually designed as a solution to creating a really soft and subtle curve used in auto design, right? So when in the 1950s and 1960s, they were trying to create really smooth and sleek looking cars, this curve was determined mathematically as being one of these most beautiful ways of creating a curve. And it's attributed to Bezier. Interestingly enough, again, he wasn't the first or the only to discover this curve. In fact, this curve shows up in nature. And it's because it's very aerodynamic. That's why it's so attractive for automobile design. But a handful of Native American populations had already been using the Bezier curve for generations. And when asked, well, how did you determine the Bezier curve? A handful of elders had said that it wasn't any one of us determined it. The wood spoke to us. The wood taught us how to make the curve. And what that means is by warping the wood in water, this curve naturally appears. And as doing so, it's aerodynamic. It's incredibly useful for things like creating rafts or ships or canoes. And so this curve can be created either through mathematics and scientific thinking or through indigenous thinking, right? And we know that there's parallels between the two. What that means is again, neither one of these biases is 100% accurate or is better than the other. All it is that there are different ways of looking at the world. So if we look at times arrow, this is the one we tend to use in the West. It's often rooted in science and mathematics. If we look at times wheel, This is often used by indigenous groups, also groups out of the East, and some Western philosophers that predate the Age of Reason. They are both ways of trying to explain how the universe works. Pete combined the two in holistic physics to try to explain how things would go. And he argued that we have progress and we move in a line, but that line actually continues to wrap around and repeat itself over and over and over again. One way to look at that would be we've got the Big Bang, and from that, the entire universe explodes. And from there, we've got the Big Crunch, which is the contracting of the universe, eventually back down to that microscopic point, which then explodes again, over and over and over again. Another modern day physicist, Michio Kaku, says that the truth of it is that in a sea of nirvana, there are many genesises. So he takes this idea that in sea of nirvana, which is this idea of repetition over and over again, cyclical thinking, there are moments of genesis that happen. Those genesis collapse and rebuild into the sea of nirvana, which is a really beautiful and poetic way of describing physics. Pete used similar language in his books to describe holism. So for your journal, if you'd like to, you could compare times wheel to times arrow, indigenous groups to Western groups, the thinking of the world when it comes to models of time, history, and cosmology, and how there are two different ways of thinking about things, and that you can come to different but also similar conclusions through different worldviews. I'll leave you with one last thought, and that is this line called "Remember your future," which is another way to describe time's wheel. The idea is that you do know your future. It is already determined. There's a handful of things that you can predict and you can remember even though they haven't happened yet. You're going to die. Our mortality is something that all humans have to face. The seasons are cyclical. Life cycles are cyclical. That things are going to repeat over and over and over again in order to create balance and natural harmony. And because of that, your job is to maintain that future by maintaining your present and your past and keeping it a steady state. That is often attributed to the indigenous peoples and why they have not lived in this cause and effect life, but instead lived in a balanced life where they are trying to maintain the future as being the same as the past. I leave you with that thought. I hope you enjoyed my lecture on times arrow and times wheel. Good luck on writing your journals. And as always, thanks for watching.